Everybody, it's Bob Surridge here. Today's Tuesday talk is going to be done by Desiree Bridge, and Desiree is in her first year as a member of the board of the society, and you're going to find out as we know that she's a very talented lady. She has two bachelor's degrees, one in history, and then the other in dance choreography,
which I don't use anymore.
Well, we'll talk about that. And she also has a degree in baking from Johnson and Wales at I didn't know, but there is a Johnson and Wales in Charlotte, I take it, and her bachelor's degree are from UNC Greensboro. When I say, oh, you have to meet Desiree Bridge, and somebody's interested in history, I say that she's a culinary historian. I hope that fits Desiree. But really has interest and a lot of experience too in colonial foodways as well as medicinal lore. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and then ask Desiree to begin.
Hi, welcome to today's Tuesday talk. As Bob said, most of my study was based in culinary, baking, foodways, but I noticed over the years doing that, a lot of what you were creating in your kitchen for just regular meals were also used medicinally. So I started studying into that, and actually I worked at Old Salem in Winston-Salem, and they had me in two locations. One, I'm either doing the research into the cooking and the baking, or I was in the apothecary doing the research into the herbal lore that was practiced during the 17, 18, and early 1900s. The reason I say into the early 1900s is you do see in some rural communities some of these medical plants still being used in place of what we would consider commercial medicine. Now, medical plant lore is a pretty deep and long subject, so we're just going to be skimming the surface of it today. I'm only going to be talking about a few plants, some of which you may have in your yards or gardens. You may welcome some of these plants, others you might deem a weed and be trying to pull out, but I'm going to try to win you over to keeping some of these weeds in your garden because they have quite a few benefits, maybe not so much for human consumption, and I'm going to state that right now. Do not try any of these plants for medical treatment, please. This is based on a medical practice that's no longer followed in America today, but they're beneficial in the sense of maybe for the upkeep of your lawn, for bees and butterflies and pollinators and such like that. I have to admit, this is my first time doing a lecture via Zoom, so please bear with me. I'm gonna try to talk slowly and into the mic. If I start getting a little too fast, just speak up and let me know. If you have questions at any time, feel free to ask. I am gonna try to stop at a point though, so that we can do questions towards the end if you're interested. So the medical practice of, let's say, the 17 and 1800s of Europe and America is not based on modern germ theory like we think of today. That's going to come later on in the mid-1800s with Pasteur. You're going to see germ theory come about in the 1880s. Prior to that, people are practicing Galen's Miasma or Mismona, miasma, it has many ways of pronouncing it, theory, which is basically the study of your humors. You may have heard of these: blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. Throughout history, people believed if you kept these humors in balance, then you were going to be in perfect health. if there was something wrong with your humor, you were going to have to balance it. Now, there could be the treatments that would involve puking, purging, bloodletting, blistering, sweating. Most people tend to think of George Washington, how when he became ill, they did bloodletting. They ended up taking too much blood towards the end of his life. But this was just a common practice during this time period. Along with bloodletting and puking and purging and blistering and such, you also see them relying heavily on medicine made from natural ingredients. And that stems from the fact that they're not using synthetic chemical reproductions of these plants like we are today. A lot of these plants that were used, especially in early America, were common garden herbs that we might have today. In fact, you see records of people bringing the seeds or the plants themselves over into America and first keeping them in pots and then trying it in their garden, and a lot of them naturalized into the different areas here in America. When it came to making your medications, you could either go to an apothecary if you lived in a large enough town. Think of that as your drugstore. And the person running an apothecary is called an apothecary. They could make the medicine for you. You could find a physician to make the medication for you, but oftentimes people made their own medicines at home. They could either be following recipes that were passed down from past generations. They could be using a cookbook of the time period, which often had a medical section towards the back. Or they could even be following their doctor's prescription, which would have a list of ingredients and how to make up a tincture or a tonic, or maybe even a plaster at home to administer to that patient. Now, I mentioned earlier blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. They're also going to think if an illness is considered hot or cold or moist or dry. And so a lot of the plants being used in medicine during this time period fell into those different categories. So if a plant was deemed moist and cold, they would use it to treat an illness that was dry and hot. And they thought that would kind of bring down, let's say, a wet cough. You're going to dry it out, whether you were ingesting it internally or maybe putting a plaster on a person's chest. Some of the more popular herbs being used in medicine pretty much come from the mint family. One of the reasons they're popular is because through trial and error, they have figured out they're antiseptic, they're often antibacterial, and they're antifungal. Now, they're not aware really of the chemical compounds of these plants and why they treat on a level we do today, but again, through trial and error and trying them, they have seen that it would relieve some symptoms. And so therefore it was like, well, if it relieves these symptoms, therefore perhaps it's treating that person. A good example of an herb a lot of people have in their garden, although they may just use it for culinary uses today, is rosemary, which is in the mint family. Rosemary was considered a very popular mild pain reliever during this time period. It was often used to treat headaches, aches, and pains. But they also believed that this herb was good to treat any type of ailment of the brain. What that means, it's hard to say. It just depended on the diagnosis and who was doing the diagnosis of that time period. To treat a person with rosemary, they could powder it and dry it and make it into little tiny pills, which you could basically swallow. You can also see them making something called hungry water, which originated in Hungary, hence the name. Hungry water was a distilled concoction. It's not just rosemary. There were a couple other plants and other ingredients in it. Along with being taken for aches and pains, it was often a popular cologne and perfume too. So you would often see cosmetics sometimes pulling double duty during this time period, not just your foods. Now, another herb that's in the mint family that was popular during this time period is what we would call catmint today. Catmint was considered a cooling plant, so you could see them being used to treat a fever, or maybe it would be made into a poultice if someone had sunburn. You also see comfrey, which I sadly do not have growing in my garden, being used to treat different types of skin ailments. Now, again, these are plants that Europeans brought over with them. Has anyone heard of horehound candy? If you've eaten Ricola cough drops, it has horehound in it. It's that flavor. Horehound would have been grown in your garden for sore throats, bronchitis, any type of chest problem. And again, in the mint family. And then you also have sage, which most of us just tend to use around Thanksgiving nowadays. But sage would have been used for cleansing the blood. So if they did not perhaps want to do a bloodletting just yet, they might try a tincture of sage to just kind of purify the body and see if that was going to make the person feel better. There was one plant that just about everyone was growing in their garden, if they could. If they didn't have it in their garden, they had it in their pot, and that is the opium poppy. That is going to be your strongest painkiller during this time period. It could be mixed with alcohol to make laudanum. Most people think of laudanum from Westerns, but laudanum recipes go all the way back to Bronze Age Mediterranean sites. So it is a very long-standing painkiller during this time period, and it's pretty much the strongest thing you're going to have if you have extreme migraines, if you have someone recovering from a severe injury. They are aware to an extent that it can be a blood thinner. Oftentimes people will ask me, well, did they abuse it? Did they become addicted to it? Yes, but it depended on the person or the person administering the opiate drug back then. It's just like today. You'll have some doctors that might push pills a little more than they should, and you'll have other doctors that want you to try other courses of treatment. So we do see records of those who become addicted to opium in its various forms. If that happened, a plant that you had in your garden was reputed to help with opiate addiction, and that's feverfew. So feverfew was not only used, hence its name for fever, but sometimes they would use it as a treatment for an opiate problem. Whether it worked or not, we don't know. Feverfew was also used for migraine headaches, different types of inflammation, and feverfew is actually in the daisy family. So when it does bud, it has these beautiful little happy flowers on it that are just, it's a wonderful plant if you can get it in your garden. Opium, if they are using it, oftentimes they might be making little comforts out of it if they're not making laudanum. We also see them taking the leaves in capsules and boiling it in sugar and water and making almost like a syrupy sweet tea, which would help induce sleep. But again, people were aware that this was a pretty dangerous drug. And from what I see in journals of the time period, most people were wary of using opium except for in extreme cases. They would try feverfew, rosemary, and a couple other plants, which in all fairness, in large doses can be dangerous, but weren't as habit forming as the opiate plant itself. A plant that I think everyone should have in their garden, just like the early American settlers had, is yarrow. I'm afraid my yarrow isn't doing too well right now. It's been a very, very wet season, so I had to dig it up, put it in a pot, and it's somewhere where it can dry out and be nice and sunny. It takes about 2 years for it to establish in your garden, but once it establishes, it's a pretty hardy little plant. The flowers could be yellow, white, pink. There's 4 types of yarrow, or actually there's more than 4 types, I should say. Yarrow's found pretty much Europe, America. It's kind of one of those herbs that we see being used across multiple cultures. Most people today, if they think of yarrow, they go back to maybe the Iliad and they think of Achilles. It was the herb that he would use to treat his soldiers. In fact, it was a popular herb to be used by warriors in the past because they believed it would stop blood flow. It could help with bruising. It was supposed to treat with bone bruises. It was basically the herb for severe injuries that are going to come from the battlefield. We do see them being used quite a bit in your garden, but one of the problems with yarrow is it can cause contact dermatitis with prolonged use. The rash is somewhat similar to poison ivy. Now, for most people, if they touch it, the skin will break out for a little bit and then it will clear up. But we do see people writing, it's a great herb to have, you must have it in your garden, but do not handle it a lot. And that was another reason it's popular, because even though it has that problem of causing contact dermatitis, is once it establishes, you don't really have to do much to it except trim it back every once in a while. So maybe the first 2 years you're gonna have to worry about that, but afterwards, this was a potent herb to have. It dries well and it powders well too. So if you're not able to get this plant during the winter time, because it is going to die back, you could harvest it, hang it, dry it, powder it, and then use it in your medical practice throughout the colder months when it was not available. I'm going to talk about one last mint before I kind of start working my way away from the garden herbs. And again, I know this is a lot. I'm just trying to get a nice round mix of herbs in for y'all, is lavender. And a lot of us probably have lavender growing in our garden. Lavender is still used today as it would have been used historically, as basically a soothing, relaxing herb. But one reason you really wanted lavender is because you also noticed it would keep bugs away. It's antifungal, bacterial, antiseptic, like a lot of your mints, but we do see people using it, especially in the fall, spring, times of the year when you might see an increase of pests and bugs. And a lot of the times when you look at the treatments, you're seeing a lot of ointments and such being used for bug bites, and they'd had just as many problems with mosquitoes and such as we do today, but also their homes aren't as insulated as our homes are today. They're not using maybe some of the insecticides and pesticides, that whether it's organic or not, that we're using today. So bed bugs, other creatures, ticks, fleas, they're going to be a common problem during this time period, no matter how clean you were. So one of the things we always see them doing is having herbs in their garden that can treat and also keep those pests at bay. Another problem from this time period is your water may not be the purest source available. You're drinking a lot of coffee, tea, maybe beer and wine, things that you know if you drink it, there's less of a chance of a stomach disorder. They're not aware that it's through either distilling or boiling of the water that renders it safe. So stomach ailments are a big problem throughout history. So every plant I just talked about, and in all fairness, every plant I will be talking about was also good for stomach disorders. So just about anything growing outside, and it varies from cultural group to cultural group, they had plants that are going to help with either skin problems or with stomach problems. Those were your two main ailments that bothered folks during those times. And before I go away from our garden herbs, I'm going to talk about one less plant, because I'm talking about the stomach area. This is wormwood. Now, wormwood could be used sometimes for respiratory problems, not as much, and that was because you do see some groups saying it kind of looked like maybe branches of the inside of your lungs and such. Again, it's not a lot of groups thought it was good for lung treatment, but I will see it pop up once in a while. Mainly though, I didn't pick this early enough, so it's not really curled in on itself, but sometimes the leaves will start curling in and it almost looks like you've got little tiny like silkworms hanging off of this. Wormwood was used to treat intestinal worms, which were a big problem in the past too, because oftentimes you're not cooking your meat as long as you should. You may not be washing the plants that you're bringing in from your garden like you should. So that's another issue that I see pop up quite a bit, is worms being a discomfort for people in the past. Now we're going to move away from our garden herbs. And before I jump into weeds, I'm first going to go into native plants. So everything that I talked about right now, except for certain breeds like your Yarrow, which do have an American counterpart, most of these plants originate in the Mediterranean area. Think of rosemary. And so they've kind of a long history of slowly migrating with people and naturalizing to different soils. Down here with our climate, these herbs work really well in gardens, especially lavender. We have a sandy soil down here, so they love it. Further north, maybe not as much, but you do see them keeping them in pots and bringing them in the wintertime if need be and such. We do see, though, early explorers using some of the native plants that they saw the Native Americans using. One of which we tend to think as solely being a culinary plant today, and that's the pumpkin. Pumpkin was used to treat kidney stones historically. I sometimes will see poultices or salves made out of it to go onto the skin too, for various ailments. So pumpkins weren't just kind of taken in and say, oh, this makes a really good pudding and pie. Let's add some old world spices to it. We do see them using it for medical remedies. They tried it in Europe, but in the medical part, it just didn't really take off over in Europe. And that's mainly because they had way too many other plants that they could pull from. It's more of an American thing that we see it being used for kidney stones and such, or at least what I've seen. Another plant that the Native Americans used, and I'm going to be careful handling this, is pokeberry. And pokeberry leaves have that nice spear shape to it. It's a very fleshy stem. It can be a pretty tall plant. I've got one in my backyard that's over 6 feet tall right now. It will put off the most beautiful purple berries. Do not eat them. Let the birds eat these berries, but do not eat them. Pokeberry can cause some issues with folks. It's a plant that's best to keep on your borders if you have it. If it starts growing in your garden itself, just go ahead and pull it. There are records of people eating the young stems, the young leaves. I wouldn't recommend it. Again, this is a perfect plant to grow for letting birds come in and eat them in late summer, early fall. The berries were used for ink early on by both Native Americans and your early explorers. They believed it could treat certain types of cancers, and they believed it could also help with heart disorders. I was reading somewhere last night that there might be some studies looking into this, but again, they're using it looks like a synthetic chemical of pokeberry that they're doing research into. And the poke family is pretty large too. So in all fairness, with the more modern studies, I don't know which plant they're looking into. I just focus on what was going on in the past. But again, if you want to have this at the corner of your property where you don't have to worry about brushing up against it all that often, all you have to do once it dies back in the winter is just cut it, throw it away, let this plant live. If it starts popping up in your garden, I would recommend kind of getting rid of it. Blueberries, which we tend to today just kind of think of a great form of antioxidants. Maybe we like it in our pies or jellies and such, but blueberries were used as a treatment for fevers and any type of ailment that would come from what we would call cold or flu today. So fever, ache and pain, sinus problem, chest problems. In fact, blueberries and sassafras were used interchangeably early on. And then for some reason, the poor blueberry just kind of falls away and is mainly used for culinary purposes, whereas sassafras, I mean, even today, you can go into rural areas of America and people have so many different sassafras recipes and what it's used to treat. It's almost like an American miracle cure natural remedy. Sassafras was also used over in Europe for a while. People were really impressed with this plant. Mexican Halp, J-A-L-A-P. It's a tuber. It looks almost like a cross between a sweet potato and a white potato when you see it. It was used as a purgative. So anytime they thought that there was an issue with maybe bile in the stomach, you could see them doing a puking or a purging to get rid of it. So this plant would have been used. I see it actually in apothecary lists, even up until the 1800s, maybe mid 1800s, before it kind of falls out of favor and is replaced by other types of medications. It is still used though in certain parts of India. And keep in mind, there is in India certain areas where you will see people still talking about the humors, blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. It may not be the same science as what you would have seen in Europe and America, but a lot of these plants that I'm talking about still are used in other countries and by other cultural groups. I'm afraid I don't have any. It's really, really hard to come by. And technically you shouldn't harvest it anyways. American ginseng. If you've ever seen a ginseng root, it's pretty amazing because often they look like little men or women. They're usually about this long. It's kind of strange how much they can look like a male or female. Ginseng is one of those herbs that just goes across time and culture. It has so many myths and folklore attached to it. It's very similar to mandrake root, which also will sometimes have a humanistic look to it. American ginseng during this time period was reputed to actually be better than old world ginseng. And you will see some people having this thought process during this time period that the new world plants, because they haven't experienced so much. Again, keep in mind, a lot of these Europeans didn't sadly consider the Native American culture over here as being an established culture and being great in their own right. They're like, oh, well, you know, it's not like Europe where there's too many of us and we've diluted the natural world. Over here, they're not really harvesting it like we would. So therefore, the American ginseng is a much stronger plant. So we actually will see in the 17 and 1800s, a lot of people harvesting American ginseng and sending it over to Europe and other countries because they believed it was a stronger ginseng than what they were using over in their country. Virginia snake root is another plant that you will see people shipping back over into Europe. And again, I'm sorry I don't have a root to show you on that one. It's a root that is pretty long, kind of has a snake-like look to it, hence its name. It was used for treatment of cancer. It was used for sweating. So that could be a form of treatment during this time period if they believed they needed to expel whatever was bothering you through your skin. The Cherokee used it for snake bites. They believed because it looked like a snake, therefore it could treat you for a snake bite. And that's a common thing you see during this time period with a lot of plants is oftentimes if it looked like something, therefore it's going to treat you for it. So for instance, I mentioned earlier the wormwood could curl and look like worms, so it's going to treat you for intestinal worms. Ginseng was used for the whole entire body because it looks like a whole body. Any plant that had almost a strange look where it looked sort of like a brain, it would treat for brain ailments. We even see people talking about a certain plant looking like a big toe, so therefore it would treat any ailment you might have with your toenails or toes. And finally, I'm going to talk about sweet bay or magnolia sweet bay. This was used for chest issues, fevers, aches. So a plant we tend to keep in our garden today solely for ornamental use was once regarded as a very strong medical plant, especially for bronchitis and pneumonia and such. All right. And finally, I'm going to go to my favorite subject, weeds, and talk about some of those poor little plants that are growing in your lawn that you may not want out there. Now, the first one I do have growing in my yard. Actually, I have a few growing in my yard, and I'm afraid I didn't pick them fast enough. I kind of chopped them down the other day when I was mowing. One is called Hoof, and ironically, it is in the mint family, and it looks very similar to the Catmint that I have here. So if you see the garden, it has kind of a, I don't know if you can see it, a square stem. It's very boxy when you feel it. It has your lovely little sprig leaves coming up and then your pretty little flowers, often a violet or maybe a bright purple color. This was a herb that was used for burn wounds.
Could you tell me the name of that again?
Hoof. So it's Alehoof.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you look it up, you're going to find it actually has about 10 other names. I just went with the most popular. It has naturalized in this country. And again, most people think of it as a weed that grows along the side of the roads or gets into the yard. It was used for burns, open wounds. So it's sometimes used like yarrow to staunch blood flow. It also is used to treat ringing in the ears. How they would do that, sometimes we would see them making it into a tincture and then soaking what we would call almost like a cotton ball and then putting it into the ear. I saw one record where they were talking about piercing the eardrum and then administering, which that just gives me chills thinking what on earth that was going to end up doing to that person's hearing. I'm sure the ringing went away after they did that procedure, but it's often known as ground ivy too, even though it doesn't look like what we think of ivy when we go out there. So I went with the more classic European name that you will see pop up in old journals, and also when you go into rural areas and talk to people about folklore and medical practices, Hoof typically is the name they'll go with. Dandelion. All right, so there's a bunch of different dandelions. There is an American dandelion. Dandelion, though, that we think of the common dandelion, a lot of them came over from Europe. Originally, it was supposed to stay in the culinary kitchen garden. You can eat young dandelion leaves. So in the spring, when you first see it popping up, and if you don't have pets that are in that area, go ahead and harvest as many leaves as you want. Do clean them before you eat them. But they're just wonderful in spring salads. If you like a spring salad mix that you get from the grocery store, its texture is very similar to those leaves, and it has to me a slight peppery flavor to it. Dandelion wine was used from dandelions. The flowers themselves, this poor little thing is in the daisy family. So in my opinion, you should look at it as this pretty little daisy that's volunteering to grow in your garden. It's great for pollinators, but more importantly, I often have people ask me how none of my plants are ever eaten by bunnies. And the reason for that is I let a lot of things grow that the bunnies would much rather eat. Common plantain, dandelion, clover. I've got probably the fattest bunny in my neighborhood that likes to just sit out in my front lawn and just take out all those weeds that I don't have to worry about. And he never once, or she, I'm not sure which it is, they never touch any of the other plants that I've grown in my garden that you would think they'd go after. So that's another plus to keeping these growing in your garden. Dandelion could sometimes be used as a dye for fabric, same as goldenrod. But then I often would see people dispute that and say that they didn't particularly care for the color. And if you could have goldenrod, go with goldenrod. Its roots were often used as a replacement in coffee, same as chicory. And we would see records of folks that maybe couldn't get their hands on coffee regularly or couldn't afford it. They would mix dandelion root in with the coffee grounds to extend its life. I've also seen records where folks would only drink coffee on Sundays. That was their day to have a treat. And so for the rest of the week, if they wanted that coffee flavor, they were going to drink dandelion roots in place of it. The Native Americans really loved dandelions. It was used to treat stomach disorders, and they also used it for various skin problems. Now, common plantain is that plant you'll see growing. It has very thick, flat leaves. In fact, the leaves are shaped very similar to the pokeberry that I have here, but it's a ground cover. It spreads its little leaves out, and then it has a lovely little shoot that comes up from it. I've had people tell me, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I'm going to go with it. I've had people tell me that common plantain could be used along with cowslip, which is another weed, as toilet paper. I'm not so sure on that one. It's not the strongest plant, but you know, you use what you need to use. It was used for skin issues though. So the great thing about plantain, unless you're a rare person that's allergic to it, you're not going to have any problems if you're out in the wilds and you do need to use it as that. It was often used for coughs and bronchitis. Sadly, it was once a plant held in such high esteem. And today you just kind of see it in someone's yard. They either pull it or it's on the side of a road and no one thinks to look at it twice. But plantain was used quite frequently through the ancient world, medieval times. And it was once considered a very, very, very potent, strong plant to have. Now, today, it looks like they're doing some research into common plantain and how it might help with lowering cholesterol. So this poor little forgotten plant seems to be finally working its way back into modern medicine. Clover, whether you have red or white clover growing in your garden, again, this is a good plant to have. It actually adds nitrogen back into your soil. So if you have poor soil in your lawn, it's going to help to kind of get that lawn back up and going. I'm sure there's going to be people arguing that fact with me, but it's okay. It was used to treat allergies, or what we would call allergies, seasonal colds and such like that. Clover honey was reputed to be some of the best honey to use for burns. And even today, you're seeing a lot of people going back to honey as a treatment for burns because it is antiseptic. It has natural healing abilities. Again, if you burn yourself, please go see a medical doctor and ask them about honey. But historically, we do see them using clover honey over various other types of honey. And then finally, a plant that came over from Europe, and I have to admit, this one you probably shouldn't mess with too much, is pennyroyal. Pennyroyal is toxic and can even be lethal. It's nothing we really have an issue with here, but it is starting to become problematic over on the West Coast. It can cause dermatitis, among other things. Pennyroyal was used for women issues, which could be a wide range of things. It was often used also in abortions historically. The problem with pennyroyal is it can just wreak havoc on your system. So that is definitely the weed I would tell you, if you see it growing in your garden, please put some gloves on and pull that one. That is not a good plant to have in your garden. So it is 11:11. I hope I didn't go too crazy and all over the place with everything. If you all have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'm here to answer them. Any questions? Ah. Well, this was kind of a.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Pam. Go ahead.
Okay. When you were talking about the blueberries and you were saying they were used for fever, sinus, and things of that sort, how about the black elderberry? Because that's one that I've been told to use the syrups, the teas, for helping out with sinus infections, and I tend to get sinus infections. So have you ever read anything?
I have, yes. I mainly was trying to go with a mix of familiar plants and unfamiliar plants. This was kind of just a very general talk today. It's such a wide, broad subject. It would be something in the future I would have to narrow in and do individual talks on different things. But yes, elderberry was used and it still is used. And it's one of those that, as far as I can see, always has good attached to its name. The same with blueberry. Whereas there's other plants that either have fallen out of trend, because with modern medicine, we realized it wasn't actually doing anything.
Right.
Or something has come along to replace it.
Replace it.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Lizzie, I was curious, as to, you were saying you see these things being used. What kind of records are you looking at? Are they doctors' journals or old wives' journals? What are you?
It is. It's a mix, and I actually have some books to show you. Some of these are, when I worked at Salem, I was able to look at various journals and diaries. So it's based on not just the people that maybe lived in Winston-Salem, but the surrounding areas, but also Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is a northern Moravian site. They would also in turn gather records throughout their history from like the Cherokee, from English, Scotch Irish settlers. And then it's just various books that over the years, luckily, sorry, my face is like right up in the screen. Various books that throughout history, people have reprinted. For instance, Alice Cook's Early American Herb Recipes. This is a very good book to kind of get and flip through. Not only that, but there are some good recipes in there if you want to try it. Plant that I didn't mention, lemon balm, which has almost this wonderful lemon candy scent to it, was often made into what we would consider pancakes and given to those that would be suffering from depression or any type of ailment where they just felt melancholy because they thought, well, it was such a happy, wonderful smelling plant. Surely the sugar is going to make them feel a little better. A book that I also highly, highly recommend is, it's a new one. It's by Judith Sumner. It's a library book, so it's got stuff all over it. The American Household Botany. This book came out a couple years ago, and she teaches medical botany at Harvard University. This book is amazing because you can take your earlier new printed books, the Early American Herbal Recipe, and cross-reference it with this. Or if you come across, let's say, a journal or diary from an ancestor, and you want to look things up, Her American Household Botany, along with other modern medical botany books, are good reference points to just figure out what was going on. She'll break down, not only was rosemary used for this, but here's the chemical compound of rosemary. This is why they thought it worked. And just basically, in layman's terms, if you're not a medical professor, it helps you kind of get a deeper understanding. You have Culpepper's and Gardner. They were two men that wrote medical books. You also have Sawyer's Herbal Cure-All, which is another good reference point. So if you go to historical sites, I recommend, or go to their websites, see what books they have. If they have cookbooks that are being reprinted, grab those cookbooks, because oftentimes towards the back, they'll have medical recipes from that area. Because again, you could go to a doctor, you could go to an apothecary, you could go to a midwife, but oftentimes it was so much easier to just treat yourself, self-diagnose yourself, and then if need be, you're going to bring in the professional, especially that doctor, because a lot of them didn't have the greatest bedside manners. And also their treatment might be a bit more extreme than what you were willing to put up with. If you can avoid that bloodletting or maybe some leeches being put on you, you were going to try everything you could and bring that doctor in. It also depends on whether a person could barter and trade with that doctor, if they couldn't afford them. So medicine of the past and how one went about treatment, it's just totally different than what we think of today. And it's nothing like natural medicine today, because natural medicine today is based on our scientific knowledge of how these plants are going to affect us. Whereas oftentimes back then, sometimes when they're doing a treatment and they see a symptom disappear, they assumed it was because it cured it, but it could be the situation was getting worse and maybe another symptom was going to be popping up. Basically, we would see that as a worrying sign. Cancer's a prime example. If they couldn't see it and if they couldn't feel it, and cancer can throw strange symptoms out there, they were often mistreating. And it could lead to, especially if they overtreat it, even with natural remedies, far worse side effects. For instance, mint. If you use it in large enough concentrations, it can cause seizures. So you will see records of folks saying, you know, administer at a high dose. If we see the adverse reaction, then pull back. Whereas hopefully we do the opposite today. We start at a low dose and we build up to a higher dose. But I was just going to say, human beings back then are just like human beings today. So I hate generalizing too much, because you might see one person doing something different than another and one physician treating differently than another physician.
From a home standpoint, was it mostly the women that carried this lore and that shared it with one another, or were the men also aware of what the different herbs and?
It depends on the education of your group, their cultural background. For instance, with the Moravians, they often had highly educated professionals living within their community. So you're more as likely to probably turn to a doctor or a physician or an apothecary. But that said, you will still see home treatments occurring. So it would be, for instance, you have a headache, you're going to take Tylenol Aleve before you call a doctor if it doesn't get better. And then if you go into more rural areas, you might see it more of a woman's trade, because again, she's already going to be in the kitchen. She is already going to be making tinctures and tonics. She's going to be distilling, preserving various items for use out of season. So it would have been just natural for that to kind of fall in. Some cultural groups, you'll see the men just as knowledgeable as the women, especially if, for instance, you have those that are in the military. They're not oftentimes going to have women right there, so they're going to have some knowledge of treatment. Sailors are going to have their interesting medical lore. Of course, at one point they realized citrus for scurvy and a couple other things. So it really just depends on the circumstance. I don't like saying it's predominantly women or male because I've been proven wrong in the past. People have been like, oh, no, I've got this record that, you know, my ancestor, he lived in the Appalachian Mountains and he knew far more than the midwives, and the midwives went to him. But then I'll have someone else say, oh, no. I knew this one woman and people came for miles to come see her for her remedies, including medical doctors.
Did the sailors tend to take those things with them on trips? Would they bring herbs and things to treat injuries, or?
They could. If you were lucky enough, there would be someone on board that could be a medical practitioner, kind of like a barber surgeon. If you look at their kits that they had on board a vessel, this medical professional's kit looks no different than the kits that the doctors on land would have had. So they're also doing puking and purging, bloodletting. Mercury was an ingredient you were going to have on hand because it would treat venereal disease. So, which was often thought to be very common with sailors. You have some very interesting enema devices used throughout history. Enemas were a popular form of getting medicine in, so we'll see them having that too. As far as what they would have on board, it would most likely be in its preserved form, so crushed and powdered, already made into tonics and tinctures and such like that, from what I've seen. Now, my knowledge in that is pretty limited, so I'm sure someone could go far more into that realm, but the kits that I've seen, they have the lovely different bottles and vials, and then the instruments that would have been used.
And that book that you showed, that's the library book, is that from the Southport Library?
Oh, no, I bought it used. So it's,
okay.
sorry, it's a used library book. I bought it on Amazon through their newer used section. And my original copy died a horrible death in Hurricane Florence. So I had to replace it a couple years ago. So when it first came out, I think I bought it through Barnes & Noble, but if you go through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, you can get the American Household Botany. And it's wonderful because it's not just medicine. It also talks about plants that would have been used for dyeing fabric, what you could have been using for baking breads, for distilling, for culinary. So if you're really interested, and for me, I think this is a good book to start off with because you can read up on that and then delve into the older sources, which if it's in Old English, some of the older sources can get a bit tiring. You'll want a basic knowledge too, because sometimes they might have plants not organized as they're organized today in a sense scientifically. Not a lot, but a few can be confusing. All right.
Any other questions for Desi? Well, Desiree, what a great job.
Well, thank you.
Great job. Yeah.
Again, it's kind of strange
Round of
doing
applause.
this. It's a little strange doing this where I'm staring at a bunch of little.
You did absolutely fine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you everybody for coming today. I want to note, last night we had a kind of a teaser event on Facebook with Mike Royal, who's a member of the society. But Mike's going to be doing a monthly Southport Stories session. And we're going to be doing that on Facebook. It'll be the third Monday of the month. So next Monday is the first session that we'll have. So it'll be Monday at 7 o'clock in the evening, of course. I think you're really going to enjoy that. Even, you know, you like myself and many others, we're not originally from Southport, but when you hear those stories of growing up, you connect in your mind to your own past and can enjoy that bit of a nostalgia kind of brought out by what Mike and others will tell in their stories. Liz, is there anything else we should be mentioning?
Did you want to mention who the next month's second Tuesday talk is going to be?
Yeah, next month's second Tuesday talk is going to be Tommy Harrelson. And Tommy, a few years ago, wrote a book about the art of Art Newton, about Southport's Art Newton. Art Newton was a photographer, artist, painter, beautiful watercolors that he did in the 1950s. And Tommy calls him the Southport's first professional artist and photographer. And the story of putting that book together, and then Art Newton's story and examples of his art will be on display. So that's next month Tuesday talk. Any other questions? Okay, you're all excused.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Des.
Thank you very much. I loved it. It's beautiful.
Oh, excellent.